The moment Emily hissed, "Either apologize to him or we are finished," my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might actually throw up on our living room rug because Jason was still standing in my doorway with that smug, wounded expression he always wore when he got exactly what he wanted, and my cheek was still throbbing from where his shoulder had clipped me as he shoved past like he owned the place. I could taste copper, not from a punch, but from biting the inside of my mouth to keep from saying something I couldn't take back, and even that felt ridiculous because the thing I wanted to scream was so simple. He had just tried to get me fired, and she was acting like I'd spilled a drink on his shoes. Emily's eyes were wide, wet, dramatic, fixed on me the way they were when she wanted me to feel like a monster for not playing along. Jason's phone was in his hand, screen facing down like a weapon he could raise whenever it benefited him, and he kept rubbing the side of his neck as if I'd grabbed him there, like he was rehearsing for the story he was about to tell. "Mark, say you're sorry," Emily repeated, softer this time, like she was offering me a lifeline instead of an ultimatum, and that tone, the one where she pretended it was about peace, about being the bigger person, hit me harder than the shove did, because I realized she had already chosen. The wild part was that none of this started with some big dramatic betrayal I could point to, not at first. It started with a lie Jason told 2 hours earlier, in public, right in front of my manager at my company's holiday volunteer event downtown. He'd shown up uninvited, wearing that clean-cut flannel and the expensive boots Emily had once told me he couldn't afford, and he'd wrapped an arm around her waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'd seen my boss's eyebrows lift, that tiny flicker of curiosity that later turns into questions you can't outrun, and before I could even move, Jason laughed loud enough for half the group to hear and said, "Man, Mark, you still mad about what happened last weekend? I told you it was a misunderstanding. Emily told me you'd cool down." Cool down. Like I'd been irrational. Like there was something I'd done wrong and she'd gone to him for comfort, for mediation, for a verdict. I watched my boss's face change, confusion, then caution. And Jason kept going, telling this half-story about me losing it, about yelling, about making Emily feel unsafe. And he said it with that practiced concern people use when they want to look like the hero. Emily didn't correct him. She didn't even look surprised. She just stared at the sidewalk like it was suddenly fascinating, and when I tried to pull her aside, she shrugged and whispered, "Don't make a scene," as if I was the one humiliating her. By the time we got home, my phone had an email from HR asking if I could stop by for a brief conversation the next morning. I sat on our couch with that email glowing in my hand, my heart hammering, and Emily had the nerve to sigh like I was inconveniencing her. Then Jason called her, and she answered on speaker, and I heard him say, "Is he still acting crazy?" And she didn't even flinch. I told him to watch his mouth. I told him he had no right to talk about me, and he laughed and said, "Prove it." That's when he showed up at our door. That's when he nudged me with his shoulder like he wanted me to react, and that's when Emily stepped between us, not to protect me in my own home, but to protect him from the consequences of provoking me. So when she demanded I apologize, right there, with my job hanging by a thread and my chest burning with the realization that I was being framed in real time, I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt like I was waking up in someone else's life, one where the rules were rigged and the person I loved was holding the rigging ropes with a calm face, asking me to thank her for it. If you'd asked me 6 months earlier whether I'd ever be in that position, I would have laughed, because when Emily and I started dating, she was the kind of person who made you feel like the world had finally softened around the edges. We met in Oak Park at a friend's game night, and she was quick, smart, the type who remembered little details and surprised you with them later. She had a laugh that made other people laugh, and she talked about wanting a steady life, house, kids, the whole Midwestern dream, like it wasn't corny, like it was brave. The first time she mentioned Jason, it was casual. My best friend, basically my brother. She said it like it should put me at ease. And at first, I tried to be that guy, the secure boyfriend who doesn't care that his girlfriend has a close male friend. I'm not naive, but I'm not controlling either. I figured if she's with me, she's with me. The problem was the way Jason existed in the space around her, like oxygen you weren't allowed to take away. He called her at odd hours, showed up unannounced, sat too close, made inside jokes with punchlines I wasn't allowed to hear. When I asked about boundaries early on, Emily would tilt her head and say, "It's weird that you're threatened." and suddenly I'd be defending my character instead of discussing a very normal request. It was subtle at first. She'd cancel a dinner because Jason needed her. She'd invite him to things that were clearly meant for us. She'd roll her eyes if I said I'd rather have a date night without a third wheel. Every time, it was framed like I was the one failing some test. "He's been through a lot," she'd say, and I'd ask what, and she'd give me vague answers about his mental health or his family stuff, like any question beyond that made me heartless. I started noticing that Emily's family operated the same way. Her mom was sweet but anxious, always smoothing over tension, always asking everyone to just keep the peace. Her dad was the opposite. Quiet, sharp, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. The first time I met him, he smiled and said, "So you're the boyfriend," like the word was a temporary label. Dinner was polite, but the air felt conditional, like approval could be revoked at any moment. Emily's younger sister, Hannah, barely spoke, and when she did, it was careful. I remember thinking it was just family weirdness, the kind you adapt to. But then I started seeing the pattern. Emily was a peacekeeper in the way people become peacekeepers when they've learned that confrontation leads to punishment. Jason fit into that ecosystem too easily. He came to her parents' house like a son, like he had a reserved seat. Her dad clapped him on the shoulder and joked with him in a way I hadn't earned yet, and Emily glowed when Jason got that attention. It was like she became lighter around him, like his approval was a drug. And when I questioned it, she'd look at me like I was trying to steal something from her. Over time, I realized I wasn't dating just Emily. I was dating a system where Jason had seniority. He knew which buttons to press because he'd helped install them. He'd make little comments that sounded harmless unless you knew the context. "She's always been sensitive. She needs someone who understands her. Don't take it personally, Mark, you're new."
New.
Like I was trying out for a role he'd already cast. And Emily, instead of shutting it down, would laugh nervously and say, "Jason, stop," in the same tone people use when they don't actually want someone to stop. I ignored a lot because I loved her, and because I'd made the mistake of believing that love, if steady enough, could outlast someone else's shadow. But shadows don't just disappear. Sometimes they move closer until you can't tell where you end, and they begin. By the time we moved in together, the line between Emily's choices and Jason's influence was so blurred, I felt crazy for even trying to trace it. We got an apartment in Logan Square, 2 bedrooms, because Emily insisted she needed an office space since she worked hybrid, and because I liked the idea of giving her what she wanted without making her fight for it. I paid most of the deposit because my job paid better, and I didn't mind. I thought we were building something. The first month felt almost normal. We cooked, we watched bad reality TV, we talked about future trips. But Jason was always there in the margins. Texts lighting up her screen during dinner, calls during movies, him dropping something off that could have been left another day. When I brought it up, Emily's face would tighten and she'd say, "You're keeping score," which was her way of making my discomfort sound petty and transactional instead of emotional. It wasn't just the presence, it was the way she protected him. If he was late, she had excuses. If he was rude, she said, "That's just how he jokes." If he crossed a line, she claimed I misread it. One night, Jason came over while I was in the shower. I walked out in a towel and found him sitting at our kitchen table, feet on the chair, drinking from one of our mugs like he lived there. Emily was laughing too loudly at something he said, and when she saw me, her smile flickered like she'd forgotten I existed for a moment. Jason looked me up and down and said, "Nice place you've got," emphasizing you've like Emily wasn't on the lease too. I said, "We've got," and he smirked and replied, "Sure." Emily didn't correct him. Another time, we were at a friend's birthday at a bar in Wicker Park, and I went to the bathroom. When I came back, Jason was in my seat, arm draped behind Emily. She was leaning toward him, listening. I stood there a second, waiting for her to move. She didn't. Jason glanced at me and said, "Oh, my bad," without moving, and Emily said, "Mark, you can sit on the other side," like I was the one being difficult. When I sat elsewhere, I watched Jason lean in and whisper something that made Emily's eyes dart to me, then away. I asked later what he said, and she shrugged and told me I was paranoid. I started feeling like I was always on trial, my tone, my timing, my reactions. If I was calm, I was cold. If I was upset, I was scary. If I tried to set a boundary, I was controlling. Jason played into that, planting tiny narratives that grew quietly. He'd tell Emily, "I just want you safe," and then look at me like I was the threat. The worst part is I began to doubt myself. I'd replay conversations in my head and wonder if I had sounded harsh, if I had been unfair, if maybe I really was overreacting. That's what constant invalidation does. It makes your instincts feel like a crime. Emily's family reinforced it too. Her mom would call and ask if everything was okay, but it never felt like concern for both of us. It felt like checking on Emily as if I was a variable that might malfunction. Her dad barely spoke to me after we moved in, but whenever Jason was around, he'd light up and tell stories about good guys who know how to take care of people, and Jason would nod like he was receiving an award. I tried to talk to Emily about therapy once, couples therapy, not as an accusation, but as an investment. She went quiet, then said, "Jason thinks therapy is manipulative when men use it to make women doubt themselves." I remember staring at her, shocked not just by the sentence, but by the fact that she offered it as if it ended the conversation. Like Jason's opinion was law. That's when I started realizing this wasn't just a friendship, it was a hierarchy. And I was the disposable piece in it, the one expected to absorb discomfort so everyone else could feel stable. I told myself I could handle it, that as long as Emily loved me, we could work through anything. But looking back, love wasn't the thing guiding her. Fear was. Loyalty to the wrong person was. And Jason knew exactly how to cash that in. The escalation didn't happen in one dramatic leap. It happened in a series of small humiliations that trained me to accept less and less, until the day I finally pushed back and the whole thing snapped. It started with money, which sounds boring until you realize money is just trust with a price tag. Emily suggested we open a joint account for shared bills. She framed it as being grown up, as building a future. I agreed, and we set it up with automatic transfers. At first, it was fine. Then I noticed little charges that didn't make sense, ride shares when she said she'd worked from home, cash withdrawals that weren't our usual pattern. When I asked, she'd get defensive and say, "Are you auditing me?" The word choice was always sharp, always designed to make me feel like a villain for noticing. One weekend, she said she wanted to plan a surprise for my birthday, so she needed a little extra flexibility with the account. I told her okay. 2 days later, I got a fraud alert text for a purchase at an electronics store. I called, heart racing, thinking someone hacked us. Emily took the phone from my hand, looked at the text, and said, "Oh, that's for your surprise," and she said it so smoothly, so convincingly, that I almost believed her. Almost. Because then she added, too quickly, "Jason helped me pick it." Jason. Of course. My birthday came and went. The surprise was a weekend trip we never took because Jason had a crisis and Emily insisted we postpone. The money didn't come back. When I pressed, she cried and said I was more concerned about money than her feelings, and I felt like a monster while silently calculating whether I could cover rent alone if things got worse. Then came the workplace sabotage, which still makes my skin crawl when I think about how close it came to ruining everything I'd worked for. Jason somehow found out about our volunteer event. Emily must have told him, and he showed up like he had a right to. My company is strict about reputational issues. We work with sensitive clients, and anything that hints at instability can follow you. Jason knew that, or maybe he didn't, but he knew how to tell a story that made me look volatile. After he planted the seed at the event, I tried to confront Emily privately in the car. I asked her why she let him say that, why she didn't defend me. She stared out the window and said, "Because you did raise your voice last weekend." I said, "I raised my voice because Jason called you at midnight and you took the call in the bathroom like you were hiding." She snapped, "See? This is why he worries about you." That's the trick. They turn your reaction into proof of their narrative. The next morning, HR asked if I had anything going on at home that could impact my work. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to answer calmly, like my entire career depended on sounding like a man with no emotions. I told them there was a misunderstanding with a friend of my girlfriend's, that it wouldn't happen again. And then, because apparently humiliation loves company, I found out Jason had messaged one of my coworkers on Instagram, someone he didn't even know, saying he hoped I was getting help and that I was struggling. My coworker showed me, confused, like she didn't know what she was supposed to do with it. I wanted to drive to Jason's place and rip his door off its hinges, but I didn't, because I knew that's what he wanted. A reaction he could weaponize. Instead, I told Emily that Jason needed to stay out of my life. I said it clearly. He was not welcome in our apartment, he was not to contact anyone at my job, and if he did, I would treat it as harassment. Emily stared at me like I'd slapped her. Then she did something I still can't believe. She invited him over that night anyway, without telling me, and when I walked in after work and saw him sitting there, she said, "We need to talk, all of us." Like this was some group therapy session and Jason was the facilitator. Jason leaned back and said, "Good, because you need to apologize to Emily for how you've been acting." My ears rang. I felt heat crawl at my neck. I said, "Get out." Emily said, "Mark, don't." Jason said, "See? This." And when I stepped closer, not to hit him but to make it clear he wasn't welcome, he stood up fast, knocked a chair over, and made it look like I'd charged him. Emily gasped. Jason raised his hands like I was a wild animal. And that is how we arrived at the moment where Emily demanded I apologize to him in my own home after he tried to ruin my job. That's the moment I realized they weren't just disrespecting me. They were rewriting reality to make me the villain, and they were doing it together. After that, the conflict turned darker, heavier, like the air in our apartment had thickened into something you couldn't breathe through. Emily started sleeping with her phone under her pillow. If I walked into a room, she'd angle the screen away. If I asked who she was texting, she'd say, "My mom," but her face would be too blank, too prepared. Jason began showing up everywhere, like he was stalking the outline of our relationship. We'd go grocery shopping in Bucktown, and suddenly he'd run into us. We'd be at a coffee shop, and he'd sit 2 tables away, watching. Emily insisted it was coincidence. I began to feel like I was being monitored, like my life had become a stage they controlled. Then the public humiliation hit in a way that made my hands shake with rage. Emily's friend group planned a New Year's party in a loft in River North. Emily begged me to go, saying it would be good for us. I didn't want to, but I agreed because I was still clinging to the idea that showing up, being steady, would eventually prove I wasn't what Jason said I was. The party was loud, everyone dressed up, champagne everywhere. Jason was there, of course, holding court like he belonged. Emily kissed me when we arrived, but it felt performative, like she was checking a box. An hour later, I overheard someone say my name near the kitchen island. I turned and saw Jason talking to a circle of people, and he was telling a story about a friend whose boyfriend was emotionally unstable, and then he looked right at me and said, "Some guys just can't handle not being the center of attention." People laughed awkwardly. My face burned. Emily stood beside him, smiling tight, not stopping him. I walked over and said, quietly, "Stop talking about me." Jason raised his eyebrows and said, "I didn't say your name." Emily immediately jumped in. "Mark, please don't do this here. Don't do this here." Like I was causing the scene by asking for basic respect. Then Jason did the thing that still makes me sick. He pulled out his phone and said, loudly enough for people nearby to hear, "I've got screenshots if you want to deny how you talked to her." My stomach dropped. Screenshots of what? Private texts? Conversations taken out of context? I looked at Emily, expecting her to shut it down, to say, "No, that's private. To protect me, to protect us." Instead, she said, "Mark, just let it go." I realized in that moment she had fed him ammunition. She had given him my words, my frustration, my vulnerabilities, and he was holding them like a knife in front of strangers. I left the party. Emily followed me outside, furious, not because Jason humiliated me, but because I didn't sit there and take it. She said, "You embarrassed me." I said, "He threatened me." She snapped. He's trying to protect me. Protect her from what? From me asking not to be publicly smeared? On the ride home, she cried and accused me of isolating her from her friends. I said, I'm not isolating you. I'm asking you to stop letting Jason sabotage my life. She went silent, then said, chillingly calm, if you can't apologize and move forward, then maybe we shouldn't be together. That word, apologize, kept coming back like a chain. Then came the financial damage that made it irreversible. I checked our joint account again, because I couldn't shake the feeling. There was a transfer I didn't recognize, a big one, labeled as rent reimbursement. I confronted Emily. She stared at the floor and said, Jason needed help. It was temporary. Temporary. Thousands of dollars temporary. Money I'd earned. Money meant for our bills. I asked why she didn't ask me first. She said, because you would have said no. I said, because it's not our job to fund him. She said, he's family to me. And there it was again, Jason's position in her world. Above me, above our life. I told her I wanted the money back immediately. She said Jason couldn't repay it right away. I said I didn't care. She said, you're being cruel. Cruel. Like I was hurting her by not letting her steal from us. I went to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to slow my breathing, and I realized my hands were shaking. I wasn't just angry. I was terrified. Terrified that I'd tied my life to someone who could look at me with tears in her eyes and still justify betraying me. Terrified that Jason had inserted himself so deep into our relationship that he could drain our account and still be treated as the victim. That night, I slept on the couch. At 2 a.m., I heard Emily whispering on the balcony. I stood quietly in the hallway and listened, and I heard Jason's voice through her phone speaker, low and intimate. He said, he'll break eventually. They always do. Emily whispered, I know. That was the moment something inside me cracked, not loud, not dramatic, but final. Because it wasn't just conflict anymore. It was strategy. The emotional climax didn't come with a movie-style reveal. It came with me forcing myself to stop hoping and start observing, like a man documenting his own heartbreak because feelings had become unreliable evidence. The next day, I requested copies of our bank statements and changed my direct deposit back to my personal account. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't threaten. I just moved quietly because I finally understood that arguing with someone who rewrites reality is like trying to hold water in your hands. Emily sensed the shift anyway. She hovered around me with that fake gentleness, offering coffee, asking if I was okay, as if kindness could erase what had happened. Then she said Jason wanted to meet for a conversation and that I needed to come with humility. I told her no. She stared at me, eyes narrowing, and said, if you don't fix this, you're choosing to destroy us. It was almost impressive, the way she could present my refusal to submit as violence. That evening, I got a call from my building's front desk. There was a complaint about domestic disturbance in our unit. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. I asked what they meant. They said a man had called and claimed he heard yelling and was concerned. I knew immediately. Jason. I went upstairs and found Emily sitting calmly at her desk like nothing was wrong. Asked if she knew about the call. She didn't even look up at first. Then she said, someone must have heard us arguing. And the way she said us made my blood run cold. Because we hadn't been yelling. There hadn't been a disturbance. It was a setup, another breadcrumb in the trail he was laying so I'd look unstable if things escalated. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark and replayed everything. The HR email, the money transfer, the party humiliation, the balcony whisper. I realized I needed proof, not for revenge, but for survival. So I did something that felt humiliating and necessary. I checked Emily's iPad, the one synced to her messages, because she had left it charging in the living room like she had nothing to hide. My hands were trembling so badly, I had to steady them against my knees. I opened the message thread with Jason. At first, it was banal memes, plans, jokes. Then I scrolled back weeks, months, and I found it, conversations about me like I was a project. Jason telling Emily, he's not good enough for you. Emily replying, I know, but he's stable. Jason saying, we can use that until you're ready. Emily sending screenshots of my texts, my frustrations, my attempts to set boundaries. Jason coaching her. Say you feel unsafe. That word matters. Emily responding with a heart emoji. Then the gut punch. A message from Jason after the River North party saying, he looked pathetic. You did great. Emily replied, I hated seeing him hurt, but it worked. Worked. Like pain was a tool. I kept scrolling, my vision blurring, and I found the financial piece too. Jason asking for money. Emily saying she'd transfer it from our account. Jason replying, good girl. And then, there it was, the thing that turned my stomach into ice. A series of messages that weren't just emotional betrayal. They were physical. Plans to meet while I was at work. A message from Emily saying, he thinks I'm working late, and Jason responding, I'll be there in 10. A photo I won't describe in detail because even thinking about it makes my chest tighten, but it was unmistakably intimate. I sat there in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. I didn't cry. Not yet. I felt strangely calm, like my body finally understood what my mind had been resisting. When Emily walked into the living room and saw me holding the iPad, her face went blank. Not surprised. Not confused. Blank, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Why are you snooping? She asked, and that was when the last thread of denial snapped. I asked quietly, how long? She exhaled, annoyed, and said, it's not what you think. I laughed once, sharp and ugly, because it was exactly what I thought. I asked, did you tell Jason to call the front desk? She hesitated, then said, he was worried. I asked, did you tell him to message my coworker? She said, he was trying to help. Every answer was a dodge. Every dodge a confession. I said, you stole from our account. She said, I borrowed. I said, you helped him smear me at my job. She said, you made me feel like I needed support. And then she said the line that still echoes in my head, if you had just apologized and accepted him, none of this would have happened. That's when Jason's name popped up on her phone screen, calling. Emily looked at it, then at me, like she was deciding which reality to live in. She answered.
He knows, she said.
Jason's voice came through, smug and calm. Mark, man, don't do anything you'll regret. I felt heat surge through me. I said, you're in my life, like a parasite. Jason chuckled and said, careful. That sounds threatening. I realized he was recording. He wanted me to sound dangerous. Emily watched me with that same wet-eyed intensity, like she was waiting for me to explode so she could justify everything. I didn't give it to them. I said, steady as I could, Emily, I'm done. Get your things. Tonight. Emily's face twisted and she shouted, after everything, you're throwing me out? Throwing her out of the apartment I paid most of the deposit for, after she betrayed me. Jason's voice said, you can't just kick her out. I said, watch me. Emily screamed that I was abusive, that I was controlling, that I was proving Jason right. And in that moment, as she stood there calling me names while holding the phone so Jason could hear, I understood the entire plan. Make me the villain, make Jason the savior, and if I resisted, escalate until someone in authority believed them. The climax wasn't a fistfight or a shattered glass moment. It was me realizing that my restraint was my only shield, and that the truth, as painful as it was, had finally exposed itself fully. The consequences started the next morning because I refused to let their narrative become my life story. I went to HR before they could come to me again. I brought a concise timeline, screenshots of Jason's unsolicited message to my coworker that she forwarded to me, and the building's complaint record. I didn't pour my heart out. I stayed factual, calm, measured. I told HR I was dealing with a personal situation involving harassment by a third party, that I had ended the relationship, and that I was taking steps to ensure it wouldn't impact my work. HR didn't look relieved, but they looked satisfied by my composure and documentation. They told me they'd note it and asked me to contact them if anything else happened. That alone felt like reclaiming oxygen. Then I went to my bank and closed the joint account, transferring what remained into my personal account, and I filed a formal dispute on the unauthorized transfer. Because yes, Emily had access, but she used shared funds for a non-shared purpose without consent, and I wanted a record. I also called my landlord and explained that my partner would be moving out and that I wanted to discuss lease options. I didn't smear Emily, I didn't rant about Jason, I just handled it like an adult protecting his housing. When I returned home, Emily was sitting on the couch like she hadn't slept, mascara smudged, eyes red. For a split second, I felt the old impulse to comfort her, the muscle memory of love. Then I remembered the message. It worked. I told her calmly that she needed to pack essentials and leave that day, and that we could coordinate through text about remaining items. She started crying and said she had nowhere to go. I said she could go to Jason. She flinched at his name like it hurt, and that almost made me laugh because she'd spent months using him like a weapon against me. Then her tone changed. She became cold and said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "Maybe, but not as much as I'd regret staying." She tried one last tactic. She said she'd tell people I was abusive. I looked her in the eye and said, "If you do, I will respond with documented evidence, and I will not protect your image anymore." That was the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, like she realized I wasn't playing the old role. Jason arrived 30 minutes later.
Of course he did.
He walked in like he had the right, and I told him he was trespassing and needed to leave. He smirked and said, "Emily asked me to come." I said, "Emily doesn't own this place." He took out his phone again, trying to bait me. I stayed calm and called the non-emergency line, reporting that someone was refusing to leave my residence. When Jason heard me say my address, his smirk faltered. Emily started yelling, calling me dramatic. I kept speaking to the dispatcher, voice steady, heart pounding. Jason backed toward the door and said, "You're really doing this?" I said, "Yes." The police didn't need to arrive for the message to land. The fact that I was willing to involve consequences instead of arguments changed the power dynamic instantly. Jason left, muttering. Emily packed a duffel bag, sniffling, alternating between begging and blaming. When she reached the door, she turned and said, "I loved you." I said, "You loved what I provided." She stared at me like she wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. After she left, the apartment felt eerily quiet, like the air had been waiting to exhale for months. I changed the locks with the landlord's approval that week, installed a door camera, and told my close friends the truth before Emily could feed them her version. I didn't call her names. I showed them facts. Some friends were shocked. A few admitted they'd felt weird about Jason for a long time, but didn't want to get involved. The hardest part was my own guilt, the part of me that still wanted to believe Emily was just confused, just damaged, just caught in a toxic friendship. But consequences don't care about excuses. I filed for a protective order after Jason showed up outside my building 2 nights later, lingering near the entrance. I had the camera footage. I had the front desk record. I wasn't going to be cornered into silence again. The resolution wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine. It was paperwork, boundaries, documentation, and me learning to trust my own perception again. It was me choosing self-respect over the fantasy that love can fix someone who's actively using you. In the months after, the closure came slowly, in ordinary moments that felt strangely sacred because they weren't contaminated by manipulation. The first time I came home from work and didn't feel my stomach tighten at the sound of a notification, I realized how much stress I'd been living inside without naming it. I started sleeping through the night again. My appetite came back. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected because Emily always made plans revolve around her circle, her needs, her constant crises. I went to therapy alone, not because Jason said men use therapy as a weapon, but because I needed a place where reality was anchored and my feelings weren't treated like evidence of guilt. My therapist helped me name the patterns: gaslighting, triangulation, financial boundary violations, coercive control disguised as concern. Hearing those terms wasn't about diagnosing Emily or Jason like some internet detective. It was about giving structure to my confusion, so it couldn't swallow me again. I learned that mature love doesn't demand you apologize to someone who's harming you just to keep the peace. Mature love doesn't outsource loyalty. It doesn't ask you to shrink so someone else can feel powerful. About 6 weeks after Emily moved out, I received a long text from her mom saying she was heartbroken and asking if we could talk because Emily was struggling.
I stared at it for a long time.
Old me would have rushed to help, to smooth things over, to prove I wasn't the monster. Instead, I replied politely that I wished them well, but I wouldn't be engaging further. It felt cold, but it also felt like closing a door that had been left cracked open for years. Around the same time, I heard through a mutual friend that Emily and Jason were official, posting carefully curated photos like they'd been a couple all along. For a second, it hurt in a fresh way, not because I wanted her back, but because it confirmed how replaceable I'd been in their narrative. Then something unexpected happened. The pain didn't deepen. It loosened. Because clarity, even brutal clarity, is a kind of relief. My bank dispute didn't magically restore every dollar, but it resulted in partial reimbursement and, more importantly, a record. The protective order wasn't granted at the highest level because Jason hadn't physically harmed me, but the judge issued a formal warning and documented the harassment evidence, which meant if he escalated, there would be consequences.
He didn't.
People like Jason thrive in ambiguity, in your fear of being seen as dramatic. Once things are documented, once you refuse to react the way they want, they often move on to easier targets. The biggest closure came in an ordinary moment. I ran into my boss in the hallway one afternoon, and he said casually, "You seem lighter lately." I smiled and said, "I made some changes." He nodded like he understood more than he was saying. Later, at home, I cooked dinner for myself and ate at the table without scrolling through old messages, without rehearsing arguments, without wondering how to prove I was good. I thought about the moment Emily demanded I apologize, and I realized how insane it had been, how my own home had become a courtroom where I was presumed guilty. I felt grateful I didn't give them the explosion they wanted, grateful I chose restraint, grateful I chose a future where peace wasn't purchased by self-erasure. I won't pretend I'm completely untouched. Sometimes a sudden text notification still spikes my heart. Sometimes I still replay that balcony whisper and feel a cold wave of humiliation. But those moments pass faster now, because I don't live in their gravity anymore. The story ends with me sitting in quiet, not the hollow quiet after a loss, but the clean quiet after a storm, the kind that tells you you're safe. Emily wanted me to apologize to the man who harmed me so she could keep her world intact. I didn't. And in refusing, I didn't just end a relationship, I ended a pattern, reclaimed my reality, and finally gave myself the loyalty I'd been begging someone else to offer.